Welcome to this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Danielle Hennis. She is the founder of Make It Memorable. She is a presentation consultant, graphic designer, and a teacher. Welcome to the show, Danielle.
Thank you, AJ. I'm happy to be here.
You're welcome to the show, Danielle. You are welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk about. We'll be talking about how one can communicate their message effectively. So, Danielle, I want to understand for you is in today's time when messaging, for messaging, there are so many different mediums, and many people say, you just have to write your message and understand that it's communicated the way it is. People use those short words, long words, even in official, communication. A lot of this social media sort of a way of messaging has come in. So help us understand then, how do we communicate in today's time? Does the old world exist, or should we also look at communicating in the new world, because that will be actually communicating effectively? So help us understand first the right message, and then how do we communicate our message effectively in today's time.
Yeah, so communicating your message is all about knowing your audience, right? So if you're communicating to a group of individuals who are, let's say they're younger, they're on social media, then you should be communicating them in the way that they are expecting to be communicated with, right? But that's going to be a very different audience than if you're communicating with an older audience who maybe are still reading newspapers, and then that's a very different way to communicate with them. So it's all about figuring out who you're talking to and how they're expecting to be communicated with. And if you're going to violate that expectation, then make sure it's something in a way that is giving a payoff, right? So if you're going to ask them to watch a long form video instead of a short form video, then you'd want to have them get a payoff and keep engaging with them throughout. And so I work a lot with presentations. And one of the things is, when I work with technical audiences, they oftentimes have a lot of information that they're trying to communicate to an audience that has a very different background than them, or maybe they don't have as niche of a background as them. And so with that, you want to make sure that you're giving them a lot of examples and case studies and stories, and that you're maybe surprising the audience or using analogies or metaphors. And that can help the audience process the information. But what you don't want to do is go in and start talking with all of the jargon that you know about your background, because the audience is going to get lost in that communication. And so whatever it is that you're communicating, you have to figure out your version of that, right? Make sure that you're not communicating in a way that you need to, that you're going to say it in a way that you understand it, but that the audience is going to understand what you're saying.
Right, Daniel. Let me understand it for the audience this way. You have a background in psychology, and you use that, your psychology background, graphic design. You help clients to take their complex ideas and turn them into powerful presentations, lessons, and visual stories. Now, you use psychology. How do lesser mortals take this whole psychology thing in their own life? Do they need to understand psychology or study psychology, or can they learn from what you teach to use that impact into their messaging? Help us a bit about this part. What are the things that they can keep in mind so that their messaging becomes as refined the way you teach to your audience?
Yeah, so obviously studying something gives you a much deeper understanding of it, but I don't think you need to study it to be able to apply it, right? So for example, in psychology, they know there's something called the primacy and the recency effect. And basically all that says is that whatever you heard first and whatever you heard last is going to be what you remember the most. You tend to forget this, whatever's in the middle. And so you can align how you're presenting your information so that the most important information comes first and last, right? So you don't have to necessarily go into the peer-reviewed research and look at it. You can kind of take these nuggets that are there and apply them, and it's going to shift the way that you're presenting the information to your audience. And with psychology, it tells us kind of how our brains are structured and how our brains function, and oftentimes it's not the most rational decision. So Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky studied kind of these heuristic effects that we had. So basically they would give you an example that your brain would automatically think there was an easy solution to it, right? And it would automatically go with whatever the easiest solution they thought was, even though that wasn't right. And if you spent a couple minutes looking at the question, you would realize, oh, that doesn't make sense. But it was something that we intuitively would jump towards. And they said that we had these two systems in our brain. We had system 1 and system 2. And system 1 would just like respond to things as quickly as possible so that they could like get the answer done and move on with whatever else that system 1 was interested in doing. And system 2 was the one that would actually like focus and pay attention. But system 2 takes a lot of energy and takes a lot of effort. And so for system 2 to get pulled online, you're also going to be using a lot of cognitive energy to do that. So as much as possible, if you can keep your audience in system 1 and keep it as like an easy to understand, easy for them to just be like, yeah, that makes sense and move on with it, then that's going to be something that it's going to be easier and use less resources. But if you need to pull in system 2, you need to do it in a way that isn't as obvious, right? And that's a way that's engaging in some way so that the audience is wanting to pull in that other system of their brain as opposed to just being like, no, I'm bored and I'm giving up.
Right, right, Daniel. Let's bring storytelling into it. How do we bring storytelling into business, especially? Because business is a much more serious stuff, and stories are different. Not everyone is so adept at doing that. So help us understand how to bring story into business messaging.
Yeah, so storytelling, I think, is a bad rap because it feels like something that you listen to as a kid, right? Or that it's something that's enjoyable. And business isn't necessarily that same level of communication. But I would argue that stories are nothing but problem solving. So it's a problem and a solution, right? If you think about your favorite story, that's still at essence what it is. There's the hero or the character has some type of problem and they're going on some type of journey to solve that problem. And so your business situation is probably the same thing. There's probably a problem and a solution. And so it's a matter of just kind of reframing it a little bit in your mind. And then once you're able to reframe it, then you can use a standard story arc. So for a standard story arc, there's the setting. And the setting is like the introduction into what's happening and the character, any emotion they're experiencing, the background that's happening. So if it was like, let's say your quarter reports came in and they were not as good as last quarter, right? And so the setting then is like, okay, last quarter, this is the numbers that we had. Now here's the problem. The numbers weren't as good. So you have a setting, you now have a conflict. And then you have a rising action that goes up. So, okay, that problem, then what does that mean, right? How are we solving that problem? How are we going about doing it? And talk about that problem, like what it refers to in the organization. And then you have a resolution and you talk about with that resolution, like how are you going to fix the conflict, which in this case would be the numbers not looking as good. And so that by itself is already a story arc, but it's a matter of kind of thinking about it that way and then engaging more in the conflict. Oftentimes in storytelling, we want to stick with the setting and the resolution, and we kind of want to gloss over the conflict and be like, well, I solved it. But humans' brains are wired to love stories. And so if you can stay in the conflict a little bit longer than what you think you would normally do, and you have details that support that conflict, not details just for detail's sake, but that are actually adding in some of those problems, then people are more engaged in trying to figure out the why and trying to figure out how to resolve it. And so I think a lot of times it's just a matter of taking something that we would normally present in a very dry format and shifting it a little bit. So Randy Olson is a marine biologist turned Hollywood film producer, and he uses this method called ABT. So he says normally when we present, we say like and. But if you shift the second and to be a but, you're going to find the conflict. So if you say like last year we had great earnings, and this year we looked at the quarter revenue, it was lower. But what does that mean? Now you have your conflict, right? So then that you've set the setting, but's your conflict, and then therefore or so is your resolution. And so by shifting those two words, so it's not just and, it helps you find that story arc.
Right, right, Daniel. So in terms of when you are designing your presentation, how much should we look at text? How much should we look at visuals? Help us understand. Times are changing so fast.
Yeah.
For example, I would bring the social media part of it. Earlier, they were talking about, you know, uh, text, long form text. They were also talking about images, carousels, and then documents, and then videos. And now again, in a platform like LinkedIn and all, they are putting that even short form, uh, coming on to the short form text, 2 lines, that will be good. So a lot of changes are happening, and that is where one place where a lot of thought leadership people want to create that impact there in whatever way they are trying to present. Help us understand that not just in social media, also in your business presentations. How do I design my presentation in a time which is changing so fast?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research that suggests that we learn best when there is spoken words and visuals to look at. So the visuals ideally should relate to the spoken words. So there's two theories. There's a multimedia effect by Richard Mayer, and then there's a dual coding effect. And so both of those talk about how when we look at, typically at psychology classrooms, so when we look at psychology classrooms and how they learn, if you have visuals and auditory information at the same time, people remember things substantially better. So in presentations, I highly recommend that you are speaking to your slides, and your slides are visual representations of what you're speaking about. And that also means that you're only showing one thing at a time, so you have more movement. And just like with social media, we have a limited working memory, which is basically what focuses on what's in front of you at any given time. Our working memory is taxed all the time. It's paying attention to a lot of things. And so if you can keep that working memory, essentially the same idea as system one, right? If you can keep that working memory to a minimum of how much effort it has to put in, then it's going to be much easier for your audience to pay attention. So if your slides are showing one thing at a time and it's visual, your audience is able to follow along with it. There's motion, so we're going to be looking at that motion, and we're not feeling like it's this overwhelming process that we have to read. And same with social media. That's why reels do really well, right? It's movement, it's visuals. Sometimes there's auditory on top of it, but it's something that's quick, it's easy, and it's built in so that you're always looking for the next thing because they're so short. And so it becomes kind of this like slot machine idea where it's just this recurring thing if you just keep swiping and swiping because the next thing might be better and better and better. So that's kind of fed into it's in some ways like an addiction, right? But in terms of communication, if you can show visuals, that is going to be much easier for your audience to follow along with. And videos have movement, which we're designed to look at, and it has visuals. And then if you can have information on top of that, that's going to be substantially easier for your audience.
Right, right. Now, during presentation, how do I feel confident? I may have expertise, but how do I feel, get that confidence in me, especially, my audience is consisting of senior people from within the organization. How do I connect? As they say, connect with your audience. So how do I look at into the eyes of those people whom I report? And those are people are watching at me every move that I'm making or saying. Help us understand.
Yeah. So I'd say first it's a matter of figuring out your anxiety level, right? So there's different levels of anxiety. There's just, I hate giving presentations, to like I'm throwing up before a presentation, and there's like a huge range in there. So I'd say first figure out where you fall. And if it's on the latter that you're like, I'm losing sleep and I'm throwing up and I'm feeling physically ill, then you probably need to get some type of like assistance. But if you're in the, I just don't like it, or somewhere in between, then I would say it's a matter of figuring out how to calm down your adrenaline. So your adrenaline is going to be working, essentially your amygdala is a section in your brain that controls emotions and also controls your flight or fight response. And so if you're in a situation where you don't feel safe, or you feel like a lot of people are staring at you, and you also feel nervous about it, then your amygdala is going to come online. You're going to have a lot of adrenaline. So the first thing that you want to do is release that adrenaline. So if you can go for a walk, if you can do any sort of exercise, anything that kind of like releases it. So if you're in the meeting and you start to feel like your heart racing and your breath is quickening, then one thing that I like to do is I'll squeeze my toes and release them. It seems like such a simple thing, but it really works. I've heard ballerinas do this before they go on stage too. And so it's a way of kind of just releasing the adrenaline in a way that's a controlled way of in a presentation, because you can't necessarily go around and start doing like squats and lunges in the middle of the presentation, but you can do that without people noticing. So first releasing the adrenaline, and then before the presentation, if you notice that you're starting to have like these recurring thoughts, that you're having difficulty kind of paying attention to where you're going to, like what you're doing, then release adrenaline first and then focus on your self-talk. So remind yourself that like it's not about doing it perfect. It's not about the audience. It's about you communicating an idea. And as long as you communicate the idea, even if it's not eloquent, even if you stumble, you've succeeded, right? And so it's about like reframing it a little bit, because then it takes the pressure off. I think a lot of times we put a lot more pressure on ourselves than we need to. And the audience oftentimes is cheering for us. They want us to succeed. And so even if it is the senior leadership, you're presenting to them for a reason, because you have some type of knowledge that they want to have. So as long as you're giving them that knowledge, then they think that you've succeeded, and then you should also think that you succeeded, right? So I'd say like those two things can work in conjunction, but the first thing you have to do is release the adrenaline. And then about just remembering that the senior leadership are real people, right? That doesn't mean that they don't have a position in the company that's higher than yours, but they're real people. They've all been in situations like yours. And most of the time, we're really empathetic of other people that are feeling nervous. Like we want that person to give us the information that they have, but we're not inhuman, right? So it's like we can see that they're nervous and we want them to succeed, and we're going to be cheering along with them. So I think remembering that is also really helpful. And then if you tend to have those recurring thoughts and adrenaline, sometimes music can be really helpful. So you'll listen to music that you enjoy, that you find positive, and that can kind of prevent some of those self-talk thoughts coming through. But I'd say like a conjunction of those and figuring out what works for you. So I recommend having like a pre-presentation routine. So before you have a presentation, before you have a meeting that makes you nervous, you do a specific set of things to kind of, one, calm you down, but also two, that you know that you have some tools at your disposal that you can start using.
Right. And how do I get feedback from such a presentation? What is the best way to approach and whom to approach in terms of getting genuine feedback, whether the presentation was successful or there were things that needed to be put into that?
Yeah, so for feedback, it's about one, asking for it, right? So you have to ask for it. And then two, I think sometimes it's a cultural thing and figuring out like what works best for the culture that you're in, both like the company and the country. And so I think figuring out, okay, would a written feedback work better? Would something that is anonymous work better than something that's not anonymous? Like what would work best for the culture that you're in? But ultimately, you have to ask for it first, right? And I find that if you can give people some type of form to fill out, maybe 10 to 25% people will fill it out, right? But hopefully of those 10 to 25%, you'll at least get a basic understanding of where some of those people fall, and you can kind of think about that as being replicated across a larger population. If I have done things where if I'm doing something new, especially, I will have a meeting with the person that ran the meeting afterwards and ask them like what suggestions they would give. Like what would if I was to do this again with the group, what would they want to see differently? And that can oftentimes be helpful because you tell them ahead of time so they can think about it, right? Like I just want to have a recap of the meeting and just kind of talk about what went well and what could be improved upon. And if it works, sometimes people don't prefer having that communication, so that could be via email, but just asking for it. And then I think just making it very clear that like, this is for me to improve upon. I want your honest feedback can sometimes be a helpful way to encourage people to respond that way. But also knowing like what works for the culture that you're in, like what has worked for you and what has worked for other people.
Right. And one last question. You talk about, making your message effective. And you have a company which is make it memorable. So, should we focus on making our communication impactful, or should we look at making it memorable, or are both the same thing?
I think it depends on what your purpose is, right? So I'd say for most communication, you're communicating for a reason, right? And what is that reason? I would say, like, actually ask yourself, because oftentimes we don't think about why we're communicating. It's like, oh, I just need to post on social media, or oh, I need to make a blog post, or oh, I need to make this presentation. But we don't really think about like what the purpose of it is. So if your purpose is just to make people aware of who you are, like brand awareness, then that's one thing. But for brand awareness to work, you also need people to remember it, right? And so I think there's also an extra layer. And if you have something that's just like a shock factor, like you surprise people, that can be effective in people remembering it. But also you want to make sure that that shock factor aligns with your brand, right? And that what your goal is. And so I think kind of like digging a little bit deeper, I personally think that if you're going to communicate, there should be a broader reason as to why, other than you just have to. And I think a lot of times we fall into the I have to, right? I have to post on social media. I have to give a newsletter. I have to give a blog. I have to write a report. But like there's a deeper level. And I think if you go there, then it also helps you reframe some of the ways that you've been doing it, because your have tos are not going to reach the audience in the same way as I want to make this impactful or memorable or enjoyable or engaging or amusing, or like any of those are going to give you a very different response, right? And so I'd say take a deeper dive into like why you're giving that in the first place.
Right, right, Danielle. Well put. And there is much to learn about communicating effectively, and you are one of the best persons to do so. You are the master for today. So a lot of people who would want to connect with you, learn from you, take your help. What is the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, so you can sign up on my Calendly page. I have calendly.com/make it memorable. There's, you can sign up for a meeting there, but I also have a 5-week presentation course that's coming up in April. And so for that, they're done online. They're always recorded, so you can always watch it if you can't attend the live one. And it's on Eventbrite, and if you use podcast 24, then you get $100 off the 5-week session. That's going to give you a lot more in-depth detail. We'll cover how you make presentations, how you design them, how you think about your audience, how you feel better, and how you use PowerPoint in the best way possible. Because I find a lot of times people use PowerPoint to just put in a title and a bunch of bullets, and that's what the template shows. So that's what they make, right? So we'll talk about other ways that you can use that. And we'll be wrapping in a little bit of AI this time as well, and how you can use that to your benefit.
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, AJ.